All the saints that have signalized themselves in the beauty of temperance obtained the full conquest over the indomitable concupiscences by subjecting them in such a manner to the rule of reason as not to allow their desires to reach out after anything that might afterwards occasion them sorrow for having desired it. They advanced so far that they denied themselves all indulgence in those concupiscences which could be withdrawn without destroying human nature. Nevertheless, in all these exercises of the virtue of temperance, they felt a certain opposition within themselves, which retarded the perfect ascent of the will, or at least a certain resistance preventing them from reaching the plenitude of perfection in their actions. They complained with the apostle of the unhappy burden of this body of sin. In Most Holy Mary, no such dissonance could be traced, for without a murmur of the appetites, and without a shadow of repugnance of the dictates of her will, all her powers acted in such harmony and concert that, like armies marching in well-ordered squadrons, they moved on in heavenly unison. As she had no rebellious passions to overcome, she exercised such great temperance in all her actions that not even the suggestion of disorder ever entered her mind. On the contrary, her activity so closely imitated the divine operations that they seemed originated and drawn directly from the supreme source, turning toward it as the only rule and ultimate end of all her perfections. The abstinence and sobriety of Most Holy Mary was the admiration of the angels. For though being the queen of all creation and experiencing the natural affections of hunger and thirst, she never sought after the delicacies that would have suited her high estate, nor ever indulged in nourishment merely for the sake of the pleasures of taste, but only in order to supply her natural wants. Even these she satisfied with such moderation as never to exceed, or ever being capable of exceeding, the exact measure necessary to preserve the radical humors of life. Moreover, she partook of nourishment in such a way as to allow room for hunger and thirst, and so as to make allowance for the effects of grace on the natural process of bodily nourishment. She never experienced the changes of corruption arising from superfluous eating or drinking, nor did her needs in this regard grow greater on one day than on others, nor was she more subject to these changes on account of the want of food. For if at any time she detracted from the food necessary to keep up the natural warmth, she was supplemented in her activity by divine grace, in which the creature lives, not in bread alone. The Lord could have sustained her without food or drink, but he did not do it, for it was not right that she should lose the merit of virtuously using these things, thus affording us the benefit of her example and merits. As to the kind of food and the time in which she partook of it, we will mention these circumstances in different parts of this history. Part 2, 196, 424, 898. Of her own choice, she never ate meat, nor did she eat more than once a day, except when she lived with her husband Joseph, or when she accompanied her Most Holy Son in his travels. For in such circumstances, in order to conform herself to others, she imitated the mode of living followed by the Lord, although at all times she was wonderful in her temperance. Of the virginal purity and modesty of this Virgin of Virgins, not even the seraphim could speak worthily, for in this virtue, though to them it is so connatural, they were inferior to their queen and mistress. By the privilege and power of the Most High, she was more free from the contrary vice than the angels themselves, who, by their very nature, could not be touched by impurity. Mortals will never in this life be able to form a proper idea of this virtue as it existed in the Queen of Heaven, for we are much weighed down by the earthliness, and the pure and crystalline light of chastity is much obscured in our souls. Our great Queen possessed this virtue in such a degree that she might justly have preferred it even to the dignity of being the Mother of God, if this dignity had not been the very source of her great purity. Measuring this virginal purity of Mary by the esteem in which she held it, and by the dignity to which it raised her, we can partly estimate how great was that virtue in her virginal body and soul. She resolved upon this purity from the moment of her immaculate conception. She vowed it at her nativity, and she guarded it in such a manner that she never offended against it, or against the utmost modesty in any of her actions or movements, nor in any attitude of her body or soul. Accordingly, she never spoke to any man except at the command of God, nor did she ever look into the face of a man, and not even in the face of a woman, and this not on account of any danger to her, but for the sake of gaining merit, and for our example, and in order to exercise the superabundance of her heavenly prudence, wisdom, and charity. Of her clemency and meekness, Solomon says that the law of clemency is on her tongue. She never moved it except in order to let flow the grace poured out on her lips. Meekness regulates wrath, and clemency moderates punishment. There was no anger in our most mild Queen, nor did she use the faculty of it except, as we have said before, in order to lend fortitude to her activity against sin and the devil or the like. But against men and the angels she made no use of anger for the purpose of punishing them, nor was she moved to anger by any event, nor did she ever on any account interrupt her most perfect practice of meekness, preserving inimitable and imperturbable equanimity, both interiorly and exteriorly. Nor did she ever show outward signs of inward anger in her countenance, in her voice, or in her movements. Her mildness and clemency the Lord made use of as an instrument peculiarly his own, and through it he wished to scatter all his benefits of his ancient and everlasting mercies. On this account it was necessary that the clemency of Mary should imitate so closely his own as to make it a fit channel for the overflow of his divine clemency toward the creatures. When we consider attentively, and once have understood well the works of the divine mercy towards sinners, and when we see that the most holy Mary was a fit instrument of their distribution and application, we will then partly understand the clemency of this lady. All her corrections were undertaken more by pleading, teaching, and admonishing than by chastisement. She herself besought the Lord, and he ordained that this be her course of action. For this incomparable creature was to be the fountain of clemency, and the depository of the law of clemency, of which his majesty should avail himself, and from which mortals should draw this virtue, as well as all the others.